Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Rand Wentworth, and I teach at the Harvard Kennedy School. I teach a class in environmental politics, and I'm the host of a series called The Road to Glasgow, where we're looking at the negotiating positions, and strategies, and climate policies of a variety of countries as they have prepared to come to Glasgow. And now we are about halfway, a little more than halfway through the negotiations, through the conference. There's over 10,000 in the core and something like 30,000 in ancillary programs and buildings. There's been a lot of progress leading into Glasgow, as we had hoped that it would be just the existence of the conference would bring out aspirational statements. And indeed, in the past few weeks, we've seen 100 countries step forward and say they will be committed to reduce methane by 30%. We've seen another 100 countries say they'll stop deforestation. The United States, having made a commitment to be net zero by 2050, net 50% by 2030, very ambitious goal. China came forward and said that they would be net zero by 2060 and that they'd stop financing of coal plants in developing countries in the Belt and Road Initiative. And India, in a real breakthrough, I think, John Kerry, I know, has been doing shuttle diplomacy with India, came forward and said net zero by 2070. Some will say, well, that's too little, too late, but given where India is, the fact that they would make a commitment is significant. All of this is encouraging, but it's not enough to avoid exceeding 2 degrees. It's certainly not 1.5. So there's a lot of work to be done, a lot of negotiation over the next week or so. But today we're really going to be focusing on Africa and African nations and more broadly, developing countries, the kind of issues they bring to the negotiating table in Glasgow. As many will know, there's been a commitment on the table for many years around requiring developed nations to make a $100 billion annual investment into developing nations to help them finance the technology for the energy transfer. There's also a whole complex set of issues around loss and damage, the legal liability of developed industrial nations and the harm that they have caused and will cause in the future to developing nations. So these are the issues for today. I'd like to introduce now the moderator for today. Monique Motty is a student at the Harvard Kennedy School. She is a Bacon Environmental Fellow here at the Kennedy School. And in her previous life, she worked for WRI, World Resources Institute. She's worked for the United Nations, the UNFCCC, in the Climate Technology Office, and most recently with the African Development Bank. Monique, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rand, and welcome everyone to this session. I'm very excited to be able to discuss Africa's position in the COP this year. And just before we begin our conversation, I'd like to have a few housekeeping rules. So if you have any questions to our guest, I would ask for you to submit it in the chat, and we will curate this and provide 20 minutes worth of student questions towards the end of the discussion. Prior to that, I also just want to give you a bit of an outline of how this will go around. So we will have a 15-minute presentation from Ambassador Seyni. He wished to be called Seyni, so please go ahead and do so when you do submit your questions. And we will have then 20 minutes moderated questions before heading into the student portion of the question. So I really invite everyone to submit their questions, as we're very, very lucky and fortunate to have a negotiator who is on location in Glasgow as we speak and who took the time to discuss with us this important subject. So with that in mind, let me introduce the guests. So Ambassador Seyni Alfa has made significant contributions to Africa and the developing world in the fields of climate change, renewable energy, and sustainable development. In September 2020, he was invited by the United Nations Secretary General to join his high-level advisory group on climate action. He also was appointed by the CEO, Patrick Verkoken, as the senior advisor for the Africa of the Global Center on Adaptation, which manages the Global Commission on Adaptation, chaired by Ban Ki-moon and co-led by Kristalina Georgieva and Bill Gates. In the UN climate negotiations, Seyni has served as chair of the African Group of Negotiators, the AGN as we call it, representing the 54 African countries from 2016 to 2017. Since 2011, he has been serving as the AGN spokesperson, and during the historic Paris climate talks in 2015, he led negotiations for Africa and the G77 in China, representing 135 developing countries on accelerating climate action, whether it be mitigation, adaptation, and finance. So he also, let me finish with that, in 2015 and 2016, he co-chaired the UN expert body on climate finance, what we call in the convention's jargon, Standing Committee on Finance. And from its creation in 2011, he has been advising the African board members of the Green Climate Fund. As an AAI coordinator since February 2019, Seyni has been leading the development of the initiative. He has ensured that it has made key vehicle for building Africa's adaptation and climate resilient programs at the UN Secretary General's Climate Summit on September 2019. So with that, a warm welcome, Seyni, and I would love to start the conversation with your opening remarks. If you can give us something of a position or historical background of the African Group of Negotiators throughout the UNFCCC negotiation process, what has been perhaps some of the achievements and setbacks that the AGN has faced over the years, some key priorities perhaps going into this COP, as well as any other issues that you would like to introduce us to.
Thank you, Monique, and good morning or good afternoon, to all colleagues here. Let's go straight into your question or your sets of questions. The first part is, you would want to know, Africa is the only continent which negotiate as a bloc. You see, you have the EU 27, but it's only the 27 countries in the EU, not all the European, not all of Europe as a continent. So we're the only one who negotiate as a bloc, the 54, as one bloc, and at the same time, climate change on the continent is the only issue which is negotiated at all three levels, meaning the African Group of Negotiators, the spokesperson of, speaks and engages the continent at the expert technical level. We have at the ministerial level a conference of environment, and we have a committee of heads of state on climate change since actually 2009, going into the Copenhagen COP15 in Denmark. So this is just to depict how important and strategic climate change is to the continent, and that comes from the fact that we are the most vulnerable region in the world for a number of reasons. Again, the first is most economies on the continent are heavily depending on natural resources. Agriculture in most countries of the continent represent 30, 40, 50% of the GDP, over 60 to 70% of labor force. But at the same time, only 3% or 4% of loans or credit go to the agriculture sector. So in a context of rapid climate change, an exacerbation of extreme weather events, floods, drought, and sea level rise and coastal erosion, this has a direct impact on development. And in most African countries, poverty eradication, access to energy, dealing with food insecurity, those are the basic challenges of most African governments. So our positions are rooted in really, from one aspect, dealing with the challenges climate change pose on development, on survival, and at the same time, recognizing that Africa, again, as a continent, only emits 3 to 4% of GHG of GHG greenhouse gases. So there's no way that as a continent that we can tackle climate change in a meaningful manner if we don't engage internationally. And that is the fundamental difference between, let's say, climate change and any of the other threats that we have known, whether pandemic-based. So, for instance, HIV and HIV/AIDS and malaria. Countries in Africa have been able to make great advance and progress in tackling HIV/AIDS as a pandemic and as a challenge. Same thing with COVID. The reality is that even if we wanted to solve climate change, well, we won't be able to, because the large proportion of emission are outside of the continent, more than 95%. That's the reason why we engage in climate negotiation or in global climate policy making, and that we take it extremely seriously. So that's on the position. On some of the achievements and setback, Africa, going into Paris in 2015, develop a global goal for adaptation, because we had over the 20 plus years of negotiation, realized that mitigation, reducing GHG emission, was basically the central focus of the UN, and that adaptation, which is dealing with the impact, was almost an orphan child, or was playing a complementary role, but not having the same level of importance and actually be treated at the same level. And as I indicated in the immediate, and what we deal with on a daily, constant basis as African nations, is addressing the impact of climate change, and having also adaptation seen as a global common, not as an undertaking that African countries have to do on their own, without linking it to also the global ambition on mitigation, and seeing the relationship. The more mitigation we do, the less adaptation we'll have to deal with. So we came up with that proposal of having a global goal for adaptation, which is really having a comprehensive undertaking of adaptation in terms of planning, in terms of understanding the needs, instead of understanding the gap which is there, gap in terms of action, finance, technology, and how that gap can be closed. And more importantly, also recognizing that the bulk of adaptation action, which is undertaken by African countries and developing countries are large, is financed by their budget, and not actually international finance. That's first. Second, in terms of achievement in Paris again, Africa was able to launch a renewable energy initiative that was already 6-7 years ago, to accelerate the deployment of renewable energy on the continent, and not just for electrification, but also for powering the rural sector. What we achieved then, which was a $10 billion support from G7 and the G7 countries and the EU, is still historical. There have been a number of initiatives launched in the meantime, but none has been able to achieve that much interest from partners. And finally, on enhancing the pre-2020 space. We're fundamental in really bringing together non-state actors, meaning private sector, local governments, and NGOs to sort of recognize their ambition, and also having that play a role as a complementary role to what countries are bringing here. Some of the setbacks, of course, you do have setback. This is a negotiation. Going into Paris, we actually had a proposal. We call it then, it died, but we call it then the Equity Reference Framework. We were working, colleagues who were more of an academic background came up with a framework where the commitments, the mitigation and finance commitment of a country would be rooted in on a number of factors: their historical responsibility, their capacity in terms of finance and technology. So that would allow to sort of inform the level of adequacy of their pledges. So let's say if you are a very developed country, with a lot of financial capacity, a lot of technology capacity, based on those elements, you would be required to do a lot more adaptation, a lot more mitigation and support of finance. Of course, this didn't fly, but again, that would have sort of helped to achieve the 1.5 degree, probably in the first instance, probably by the first round, because you would have to match up your technology and your finance level, and not just make this a political submission. Access to finance, that's also another setback. We've been able to achieve a number of decisions in ensuring that finance would be provided, but accessing finance is still very much a challenge, as well as the capacity in a comprehensive manner, capacity to formulate science, to formulate policy, capacity to mobilize and access resources, capacity to execute, and capacity to implement at the local level. Three sets of priorities, and I'm closing there. Three sets of priorities for Glasgow. First, ambition. You would recall, just before the Paris Agreement, we were on a 4-degree trajectory, with the first submissions of NDCs, nationally determined contribution, i.e. countries' strategies and plans to fight climate change. We got onto a 3.5 trajectory. Then coming into Glasgow, 2.7. What we've heard so far from the IEA and other technical bodies is that if all the announcements which were made, Nigeria going net zero, India going net zero, Turkey going net zero, Russia going net zero, well, we'll be at sort of 1.9 by 2100, which is, so we want to continue that. We want to continue extracting ambition and having a clear roadmap in the next few years, and see if we can really achieve that 1.5 goal. On adaptation, we came in with a proposal, a very comprehensive work program to operationalize that global goal that I mentioned. And third, on finance, two elements to that. The first element, I think it was mentioned, the 100 billion pledge 10 years ago hasn't been met, and we believe that there's provision to close that before next year. COP is in Egypt next year, so before we land on African soil, there is a possibility to do that, and we have a proposal for addressing that. And we're also working on the new goal, which is going to replace the 100 billion. And in that as well, Africa has a proposal in really having a technical group of high-level experts who would look into the needs, looking into the financial sources, put in place the right transparency and accountability mechanism. This is under negotiation now. I'll sort of stop here because I really want this to be as as interactive as possible. But thank you.
Thank you, Seyni. These are really good, great points that you discussed on setbacks, on priorities, and on achievements of the African group. Now, before I go into other questions, I'd like to just ask you, why would there be a new goal, a new financial goal, if the 100 billion hasn't been met yet? What's the logic behind here? As you just mentioned, so from my understanding, there's a discussion on new financing. But if 100 million hasn't been met, why push for a new for a new financial objectives?
Well, 2 points. The first is that the goal, the 100 billion goal, was a political goal set in 2009, actually 2010. And frankly, the reason why it was not met was because there was a certain administration in the US which pulled out of climate change, of the Paris Agreement. Most probably, if not for that situation, we would have achieved the 100 billion. So that's a reality. The second, why a new goal, is because in Paris, we went from in mitigation and adaptation, we went from a system where only developed countries had to commit to mitigate, to a system where now everybody is pledging to reduce emission. So in Paris, the deal was, developing countries would engage in more mitigation activities, but they will need to be supported. They'll need to be supported by technology. They'll need to be supported by finance, enabled to do that. So that's why the package allow for setting a new goal, and hopefully now a goal which is informed by technical work to sort of look at the adequacy level of what needs to be done, rather than just announcing a political figure.
Okay, that's great. That's a great answer, and it's a great segue to my next question, which is, what's it like to be in Glasgow right now? This is the second official week, the third week, if I'm not mistaken, unofficially, because the negotiation starts before the COP actually begins. What do you see forward right now? What's the ambiance like, and where do you see kind of these goals and this new ambition to have a new financial program that's based on needs and not on political will? So if you can give us just a bit of a taste of what is going on in Glasgow.
No, the ambiance is very positive, and it's not because I'm here having a conversation with with an American university, but the ambiance is very positive for a number of reasons. First, we had the Paris Agreement because of President Obama. I mean, if it wasn't for the US seriously getting involved and lobbying and making sure that all the peers economically engage, we wouldn't have the Paris Agreement in 2015, and we would definitely not have the agreement come into force a year later. So having the US back in a very meaningful manner, President Biden was here, his Secretary of State was here, Special Envoy Kerry is actually in the negotiation rooms. We have a number of US senators, I think that 20 or 30 US senators there. So when the US leads, usually you tend to see other countries responding, which in the last 4 years has been extremely lacking. So in terms of ambience, the ambience is very positive. Negotiations are what they are. Ask me Friday night, but some of us are very optimistic, if I can use that term. But we can, we are in a position where we can make substantive progress here for the global agenda.
Great. That's great to hear that there'll be positive outcomes, hopefully. But yeah, we will have to see on Friday. Speaking of which, last week there were the heads of states that gave a very strong opening to the COP. And now that they're back home, what are the big issues that are being negotiated this week?
Well, the negotiation agenda is actually set way in advance, and we have about at least 50 agenda items spread across a number of themes. Finance has 20 or so agenda item, adaptation, loss and damage, transparency. We have about 50 agenda items. So what heads of state allows and inject into the process is, of course, political momentum. They make announcements, and that sort of tries to keep the momentum high. In this second week, we have ministers attending, ministers negotiating, trying to then close down the technical work.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so as you're going along with your work the second week, do you think that industrial nations should be legally liable for the loss and damage to developing nations?
That's a very tricky question. What I can, the answer I can, nobody would want to be, how would I say, nobody would, and no country for sure would sign to an agreement which would make it legally liable, on an, to an sort of an indefinite amount, or to an amount which could be astronomical. And if you read the Paris Agreement, developed countries were savvy enough to include a provision, actually under loss and damage, to ensure that this provision will not lead to compensation. And I think that is explicit to their, how would I say, to their position of not having any financial liability, because again, this could be potentially astronomical. I think last year, the cost of extreme weather events was almost $500 billion, and this is just last year. And the way climate change is going, and the way we're seeing the increase in the intensity, the frequency of extreme weather events, that could potentially bankrupt any insurance. I mean, I can't imagine any insurance company would sustain over a long period of time that much catastrophe.
Yeah. So how should we, in a sense, pay for this if one won't be held responsible and everybody's going through the consequences? Someone has to pay. What's the AGN's position on that, knowing that they've contributed the least to the issue, and they still go through the consequences of climate change? How is that being translated?
Clearly the rationale for providing climate financing is in the first place is recognizing the responsibility in having created the problem. That's clear. Now, recognizing one's responsibility and then having legal legal responsibility to sort of pay for to pay for the consequences, and all the consequences, it's something else. So the very basis on providing climate finance is based on historical responsibility. But loss and damage is a bit, again, is fundamentally different in the sense that what it poses as a financial challenge could be extremely important. So it's almost the loss the loss could be, well, open-ended, so to speak.
Okay. Okay. Yes. So in that sense, then the developed countries don't want to be put in a liability situation, but they do recognize their implication. Which brings me to my next question. Many developed nations have made commitments to reduce emissions through their NDCs. What is the position of African nations on updating their NDCs, following what you've mentioned about the low contribution to the problem, the high cost, the need for technology? How is that being translated in the NDCs now?
Well, the reality is that most, if not all African countries have actually, as being party of the Paris Agreement, have to submit their contributions. So in 2015, I think out of the 54 African countries, 53 submitted the NDCs, and we're very close to the same levels now, because that's just part of the commitment under the Paris Agreement, and they see also an opportunity to access technology, an opportunity to contribute, and frankly, with the decline cost of renewable energy, this has been also an opportunity to change the energy mix for options which are more cost competitive and at the same time more sustainable in the longer run, looking at the potential for renewables on the continent.
Okay, I'd like to jump into that segue, since we're already talking about I guess sustainable energy solutions. What do you think are the prospects for solar and wind energy in Africa being financed through the various financial mechanisms that are being in place under the convention? Do you think it's feasible for African countries to consider that solar and wind energy could be financed and implemented as a response to climate change under the convention?
I mean, it is definitely. I mean, it is happening. The pace can be definitely scaled. We know that the economic potential of renewables is very high on the continent, on all sources, whether solar, wind, biomass, or geothermal. Actually, the group did some work a few years back to sort of identify the key barriers in deploying at scale renewable energy, and we're very surprised to see some of the barriers. One of the first barriers was actually policy stability. If you're going to invest in renewables, you lock in capital for 20 to 25 years, maybe plus. So you need to have policy certainty over that period of time. You need to have in place the kind of regulation which can also attract private capital. And when I say private capital, it's not even international private capital, even domestic private capital. Most of the national utilities on the continent are not doing well in terms of their balance sheet, and hence when you sign a power purchase agreement, the investor would ask for a premium, or would ask for further guarantees, which sometimes the government has to come in. The grid on the continent, the grid infrastructure needs major upscaling or repair and maintenance. You need to build capacity throughout with the different stakeholders. And when I say building capacity, is at all levels: the regulators, Ministry of Energy, and private sector in formulating and implementing program and projects. But we have seen, of course, we've seen very good examples or programs which scaled up renewables on the continent. And we have the dual challenge in most of the countries to deal with energy access in sub-Saharan Africa. And then in Northern Africa and South Africa, for instance, is more of a transition to more sustainable sources of energy.
Okay.
But the opportunities are great. The opportunities are really, for renewables and now for green hydrogen, there's really great opportunities to advance renewables on the continent.
Well, that's a promising COP if we're able to increase that type of engagement from all the parties into accelerating sustainable energy deployment on the continent. I want to go to a question which is one that has a particular importance for the continent, and that's deforestation. So what has been African nations' position on the call to end deforestation by 2030? How have the AGN been pushing for that, if they have, or what has been the position regarding ending deforestation by 2030? Well,
the continent has been at the forefront of sustainable forest management and ending deforestation. The challenge, though, is that if you look at, for instance, the Congo Basin, take a very good example. So you need to look at deforestation in an holistic manner and look at the drivers of deforestation. In the Congo Basin, the biggest driver of deforestation is access to energy. So if access to energy or access to modern energy is the biggest the biggest driver. So if you don't address that driver, then you're not going to have the solution. And this is a very complex. You almost have to have a systems approach where you really identify the drivers and you deal with that to be able to achieve the outcome that you want. Because it's not just a deforestation or a forestry issue. It's an access issue to energy and to modern source of energy that we need to deal with.
So you believe that addressing then the energy access issue will also have direct positive impact into the deforestation problem? Yeah. Okay.
Totally, because there's a direct correlation, and it has even from some of our study, deforestation, and deforestation and energy or access to energy. There's a high correlation between the two. If you can increase rapidly access to energy by modern sources, then you'll see an halt in deforestation to some extent, at least in the African context, which may be different in other regions of the world.
Okay, that's a great point to bring in back the question of financing then, because this all comes back also to, who's going to pay for all of this, right? So what is the position of African nations on Article 6 and the potential to create private market carbon trading? There's been a lot of legwork being done by the EU with the CBAM, I believe it's called is it carbon-based? I'm forgetting the rest of the term. It's carbon-based system, which is to be added to their carbon trading initiative to enforce carbon taxes to be paid for all imports in certain sectors going into Europe. Now, that will probably have an effect on some of the sectors in Africa, but there's a lot of export that's being done on the continent. So what is the possibility for Africa to also hold form of carbon tax or a carbon paying mechanism? And can that be enforced under Article 6 of the Convention?
Well, I'll talk specifically about our position on Article 6, and then I'll talk about maybe some of the opportunities. Right now, there's three sticky issues on Article 6. For those who are not aware, are basically, let's say, negotiations for markets, for new market mechanisms under the Paris Agreement. And the first point for us, and that's because in the former markets out of the Kyoto Protocol, which was the agreement before Paris, there was a levy on the sale of carbon units to fund adaptation. And that for us, as a matter of principle, to sort of have mitigation fund adaptation is key. So that is the first tenet of our position. The second is to ensure that you have integrity in the different accounting rules. So what we did in the past is that we sort of use national circumstance, or we were flexible on countries' national circumstance, and we would frankly bend the rules to suit different national circumstances. And we are clear now, but the ambition that we need would not allow for us to do that. We need to have very stringent rules to ensure that a ton of reduction is a ton of reduction, or a unit ton is a unit ton. So we're very inflexible on the accounting rules. And the third element is around units pre-Paris, or units before 2020. We want to ensure that we have, ideally, no units transferred in 2020, to sort of be sure that we have the most ambition. So those are some of the three tenets. Now on the opportunity side, again, in the Congo Basin, there is now a climate commission. The African Union has set up a climate commission, and that climate commission has worked on identifying a portfolio of programs and projects, and not just around, let's say, carbon credits or around market-related projects. They've taken a comprehensive approach, energy, sustainable forestry, access to water. They're really looking at all the critical elements to come up with bankable programs and projects, which could be financed by, either carbon finance or climate finance or development finance, to really increase the standard of living of the people in the region. So we're doing both. We're looking at the negotiations, but really ensuring that we respect environmental integrity as the first tenet, and at the same time having a comprehensive undertaking and not just focusing on carbon markets.
Okay, that's a good point, and it's great that the African Union is also steering in the conversation to make it a coherent and comprehensive solution for all the countries. I will ask you a few questions that are coming from the chat and that we received prior to this call. One of which is from a fellow Bacon fellow, and he asked me to ask you, what are your views on the limited importance given to resilience and adaptation as compared to mitigation in climate negotiation? So how do you think we can increase adaptation's place in the negotiation? As you've mentioned, that has been the one of the struggles of the African nation to have the same importance or weight being given to adaptation as has for mitigation. So yeah, what would be the solution to increase adaptation in comparison to mitigation?
I hope the colleague who was asked that question is in the call, because this is what we've, this was the question that we posed, to ourselves going into Paris in those 4 years that we call the Durban round, from 2012 to 2015. And that's what we try to achieve through this global goal on adaptation. What it seeks to achieve is to link the temperature goal with the mitigation ambition and the corresponding impact. I'll take a concrete example to make it plain. If you want a 2-degree world, or a 3 or a 1.5 degree world, you need to achieve a certain amount of mitigation to achieve that. I mean, you need to undertake a certain amount of mitigation to achieve a 2-degree, a 1.5, and we can cost that, we can quantify that. The reality is any of those world, 3, 2, 1 degree, has a corresponding adaptation impact. And worst, it has a corresponding adaptation impact, and it has residual losses and damage. But unfortunately, we did not in the past link those 4 elements together. We actually didn't even have we only had a temperature goal. Pre-Paris, we had the 2 degrees temperature goal. So we had a temperature goal and then a mitigation goal, but we didn't link adaptation in that relationship to say, well, a temperature goal has mitigation, has corresponding impact, and has a residual. So those 4 elements have to move together in an organic manner. So that's the reason why we're pushing for this comprehensive work program here in Glasgow, so that other colleagues understand the really interconnectedness between those 4 elements: temperature, mitigation, adaptation, and then the residual losses and damage. Because by choosing a specific temperature, you're answering to those, you are implicitly, choosing a mitigation, meaning a reduction budget or a CO2 reduction budget, and impact and the rest, but it's not explicit. And we want to make it explicit by doing that work. So that's in our, it's good, but this conversation is happening at a university because it's a very elegant academic way to present it, which may not, and here we're not in academia, we're in negotiation, we're in a very politically charged negotiation. But the idea came from that academic undertaking to sort of link really adaptation and loss and damage in that manner.
That's very interesting. That would be a great research subject. Perhaps we can
Yes.
we can get the CPL to find some funding there for Harvard to lead that discussion on how to link. This is a wink to my own.
I know at least a colleague or two are now conducting their PhDs on some of this work. So at least it has prompted colleagues even in the Africa Group to continue the academic exploration of this.
On how to link adaptation and loss and damage.
Exactly, and actually even coming up with quantitative models. Yeah, and coming up with very quantitative models, and then having those models informing the political process.
Excellent, that's great. So we have another question on the board from Alice, who asks, what does AGN think about the fact that China is still considered a developing country? Because as you compete with China for these various funds, as you're considered, as we call in the jargon, non-Annex 1 countries. So what's the position of AGN regarding that in the middle or transitional place that China has? And it's not one to neglect. It's quite a big project, even when we look at the type of funding that they're able to get for climate projects that could have been also shared with other less big countries, really. So what's your take on that?
Well, I'll answer. I know the underlying assumption. I'm not going to address the underlying assumption. I'm going to answer to the question squarely. The reality is that we're not competing. If you do an assessment of Chinese projects at the adaptation fund or the GCF, it's minuscule. The
Green Climate Fund.
So the reality is that we are not. I'm not aware of even a $100 million that China brought to the GCF, or I think it's like no project at all. So that is not there, at least in that competition to access resources, is not there. So that's a fact. And then second, as a developing country, it's again, I mean, you just don't have China as a in the G77. You have Qatar, you have the UAE, you have it's interesting. We had a very old, very experienced veteran finance negotiator who is no more, and the way she answered to that question is that, well, if I happen to, let's say tomorrow, I don't know where you're from, Monique, but your country sort of discovers a lot of hydrogen. I'm not going to say oil and gas, but let's say tomorrow that your country discovers a lot of hydrogen, and somehow GDP per capita is now $100,000. $100,000. So yes, you have somehow created a lot of wealth for you. Will we, as the rest of developing country group, take you out of G77 and China? No, probably not. We will definitely have a conversation with you in, let's say, South-South cooperation, but this is not the space for that. We have a space to engage in South-South cooperation, and clearly we will have that conversation with you in seeing how you can address, you can sort of make a fair contribution on the basis of international solidarity or African solidarity, or so there are other ways and means to address that. But in this specific multilateral regime, this would not be the space to do that. And if you actually check, China is a great provider of climate finance. That's factual. Similar to a number of other countries who have a very high GDP to GDP per capita ratio. So I think that's what I can say. There haven't been a competition with China, and at the same time, so far, I think that they have done their role. They have played their role. They didn't quit the Paris Agreement. It's not because of China that the 100 billion is not on the table. I mean, so far, they've honored their commitment, which I cannot say for others.
Okay,
so,
well, that's a great that's a great point. I think there is also a point as we're closing, because time is about up, to mention that a part of the division of the countries has got to be because of the historical contribution to the issue. So China finds itself in a place because of that definition, more so than its economic drive or current development. This is still based on historical data to the issue. So that is also a big part of why China is still part of that group.
Exactly, but at the same time, I think that they also feel the pressure. I think that they know that emissions have to peak. They know that they have to invest in innovation and in technology. Their markets, their markets are in developed countries. The regulatory framework might change. For instance, in the EU, having a carbon tax at the border probably soon. So they are, I think they're paying attention, and from what I gathered actually in my different engagement with China, they see the transition to net zero, and they see it as a great opportunity, as a great economic opportunity. Whether by investing in renewables or by investing, I think the last time I checked, they had more than 100 companies were producing e-vehicles. So they see that, or if you check their investments in smart grids. So
Yeah.
they're catching up, and they're positioning. I think they're not doing that bad. And we're pushing them, and we're pushing all the major contributors to do more. You can trust me that we're pushing them.
Well, thank you very much for these insights. We have come to the end of our hour with you, and again, I really want to thank you for taking the time to explain a lot more of Africa's position. From what I can recall really quickly on the positioning, the challenge still remains that Africa has been the least of a contributor to the issue and still faces the greatest of challenge, that adaptation has been at the forefront of all parts of the negotiation, being linked to political deals and making sure that there's a financial and technical background that is also linked to all these deals so that we can actually see the changes. And also the fact that there have been quite a few achievements of just recognizing the role of adaptation and ensuring that in the priorities at Glasgow, that the ambition from other countries will continue to increase, and that we'll be able to operationalize the funds to be transferred. So thank you again for this hour, and I wish you a great week ahead in Glasgow. I hope you don't leave it all to Friday, so you still have a few days then. Don't let the negotiations start on Friday.
Don't worry, I still have 18 hours days.
Yes, exactly. And with that, I'm going to switch it over to Rand so he can give the closing remarks. Oh, Rand, you're in mute.
Thank you. Monique, thank you for moderating. Ambassador Seyni, thank you for helping us understand the complex issues facing Africa. I want those who have followed this program to know that we'll have one final program when Professor Rob Stavins returns from Glasgow, so watch for notices on that. With that, we're adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.